Mr. Chairman,
Articles of Confederation now resolve this convention. The national government ought to be established. Consent to this Constitution.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us for Lesson 3, Discovering America's Great Success Formula. Now, the founders had very few original ideas of their own, but rather they looked to the world's history to discover the natural principles relating to government. They identified what works and what does not work. They gleaned much of their insight from two primary civilizations that had some of the earliest successful forms of representative government, the Israelites under the direction of Moses and the Anglo-Saxons. We take our study now to a rediscovering of America's great success formula. Now, Thomas Jefferson had done a tremendous amount of research in trying to figure out what types of government that we should be focusing in on. And so he discovered these two great civilizations. But before we go into those civilizations, we've got to change your kind of way of thinking a little bit, back to the way that the founding fathers were thinking. Now, in today's way of thinking, when it comes to political spectrums or governments, what kind of government do they tell us that's way, way over here on the far, far left? Communism, right? Communism. And what kind of government do they say is way over here on the far right? Fascism, right? Communism on the left, fascism on the right. Now, is there really much difference between the two? No. There really isn't. The only difference is that communism, you have the total control of all property and production is owned by the government. Fascism, you have private property, but it's totally 100% regulated by the government, okay? So, for example, today we've got a great example of that. If you were to take the Affordable Care Act that was recently passed a year or so ago, and we were to put it, where would it be? Over here, probably on communism, right? Because we have this communal living where everybody pays into it, and then you end up with this health care by the time it's all said and done. And so you're over here toward communism, socialism, communism. But the good thing, the Republican Party's here, right, to give us a whole new great solution. What's their solution? Their solution is private ownership of insurance and health and health and things, but 100% government regulation. Which one do you want? Neither one, right? You'd rather have that balanced center or between the two, which is freedom, right? Now, freedom is something that neither party is considering, but freedom is the solution. In fact, I've got a great example. My wife and I, when we were first married, she was a school teacher. And so she had great health insurance, right? And so she taught school for a few years. And then as soon as the first child was coming along, we had this great health insurance, go to the doctor, all these proper checkups and ultrasounds and all those things. And we gave birth to this beautiful baby girl and just no problems. And so then my wife decided that she was going to stay home with the kids because we believe in small classroom size, right? And so she's just going to stay right home with the kids. And so she quit her job. And so I'm self-employed and had to get a individual policy. And so we got this policy, and in order to save money, we didn't have maternity on the policy. No big deal. When we're ready to have another child, we'll go ahead and put that on there. We totally forgot about that. And all of a sudden, she's pregnant with our second child, and we don't have maternity on our insurance. Well, I had been taught, she had been taught, you got to have insurance. You don't have insurance, you're going to go bankrupt. So we're literally thinking bankruptcy, just right off the top of our head, because that's what we've been taught. And so we start kind of looking into it. We call the hospital and say, we don't have maternity on our insurance. Oh, no big deal, the hospital said. We've got a cash deal for that. I'm thinking, oh no. What's this amount going to be? So I said, what's the cash deal? They said, well, there's a cash deal and there's payment plans. You just have to pay, have it paid off before the labor and delivery. So I'm waiting for this astronomical amount. So okay, how much is it? And I'm bracing myself. It's $3,500. $3,500? I mean, that's kind of a chunk of change for a young family, but I can do that. We save up some money, make payments there. That's no problem. And then I was in the custom concrete business. We do this beautiful stamped concrete. And so that was just for the hospital at $3,500. And so we still had the doctor. Well, our doctor now has a lot of beautiful concrete at their home, right? And I always remind my kids that they are worth their weight in concrete, right? So we just traded that part out. paid the $3,500, had this beautiful baby boy, and no problem. So all of a sudden, the third child comes along. So I call the hospital up and get the price. It's $3,000. Well, we can do that. And so we save up the money and have another beautiful baby boy. And then our fourth child comes along, the third child that we're paying cash for. And this is just a couple years ago. And I call up the hospital. It's $2,500. The price kept going down. It started at $3,500, kept going down to $2,500, right? And so, and why was that the case? Because I live in Gilbert, Arizona. It's this population of a couple 100,000 people, and it has the highest per capita percentage of kids under the age of 18, and it has the highest percentage of people that live together that are married. Very strong family community. So we're kicking kids out like crazy in this community. I'm just popping them out. So in this time period, with these 3 children, there were 2 new hospitals that had been built in my community, both of them specializing in labor and delivery. So competition had brought the price down from $3,500 down to $2,500, and the facilities were a lot better. So better product, safer, cheaper. Okay? So competition is bringing it down. Now, interestingly enough, when my daughter was born, my last child a couple years ago, she just slightly sick, and so the doctor wanted to keep her in the hospital. So that portion is covered by insurance. So the insurance company gets billed for that, and they accidentally billed the insurance company for the labor and delivery as well. And so I saw that bill. They billed the insurance companies $14,000 for what I was paying $2,500 for. Now, because of my deductibles, had I gone through the insurance company, I would have paid $2,800 in deductible. I would have paid more money by having the insurance than I did by not having it. And so, and those prices came down. Now, I don't blame the hospital for charging that much to the insurance companies because it costs them a lot of money to work with those insurance companies. They've got to do all the paperwork processing. It gets denied an average of 3 or 4 times. They've got to reprocess it. They also know that as soon as they charge $14,000, they're going to knock the price down. And by the time it's all said and done, they're probably profiting about the same amount of money as the $2,500 that they got from me. And so I think the whole system is kind of messed up. But freedom worked. Look at how the free market worked in this situation. And this is the example that I was explaining to you, that when we try to live the principles, sometimes it's hard to get out from underneath government. And we think that it's just so impossible because they're entwining themselves into our lives. When this circumstance showed me that even though we have health insurance and government intervention and all this health care, we can still step outside that. And we can still be free. Right? And it's a challenge. It's tough. We've got to take some personal responsibility, right? But it's very difficult. So freedom is the solution to most things. And so it's a great solution.
So
Question?
In the modern political system, would you say it's more accurate to say big government versus libertarianism as opposed to fascism versus communism? Would that be a more accurate representation?
Well, thanks for asking, because we've got a perfect representation. It's the way that the Founding Fathers measured government or political power. It's the same way that we measure everything. If you have a yardstick, where does it start? 0, and it goes to 100%, right? And so we have the exact same thing. If you see on the bottom of page 15, it's the confusing political spectrum of today. You turn the page, and we're going to see what the Founding Fathers had. Number 3, George Washington described the human struggle wherein there is a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny. So from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny. Start with 0 government's anarchy, 100% government is tyranny. Right? Same way you measure everything. Because on that, the confusing political spectrum, where do you want to be placed on that spectrum? There was a guy that was running for governor in Arizona a number of years ago, and he kept saying that he's a little right of center. Well, what does that mean? He's a little closer to fascism than he is communism? Do you really want to be placed on that scale? But this scale, the way that the founders measured political power, was starting from 0, anarchy, and going to tyranny. And you can take any government at that point and place it on that scale to determine what type of government it is. So Thomas Jefferson emphasized the same point in number 4. We are now vibrating between too much and too little government, and the pendulum will rest finally in the middle. And so you'll see the chart there on page 16, the founders' political spectrum, anarchy on the right and tyranny on the left. And so here under letter B, you'll see where the founders wanted to try to figure out how to get our government to be placed in that proper balance. They needed to find that balance center between anarchy and tyranny. In fact, here in the next couple of days, you'll probably be out talking to some neighbors or friends or whatever, and they're going to say, "Did you see that great game? Did you watch that great game the other day?" And you say, No, I wasn't able to." "What do you mean you weren't able to?" "Well, I was at this seminar thing." "Well, what was so important that you missed this great game?" "Well, I was at the seminar and we were talking about talking a little bit about the Constitution." "The Constitution? What are you, some kind of radical?" Right? They might say that. They like to make us believe that because we're out here studying the Constitution and fundamental principles of government that we're some kind of radicals. And so you're going to say, no, I'm not a radical. I'm in the balanced center. Now, they won't know what you're talking about, right? But this is a good learning opportunity. You can say, everybody's trying to place us into conservative and liberal and Democrat and Republican and fascism and communism. But we're in the balanced center between anarchy and tyranny, right? We want to find that perfect balance because government's important, but not enough government or too little government is not the way to go, and too much government. It's balanced center. So the founders, they wanted to try to place us on this political spectrum in a proper area. Now they had a great understanding of what it means to live under tyranny, or we call ruler's law. So you'll see here under the diagram under letter B, this upside down pyramid. First of all, that's the first problem with that pyramid is it's upside down. It's not very stable, right? And so you've got some problems there. The other problem is you see that all the power starts with the ruler, or the national government. Then it comes down to the state and the community, and right down to the family, and right down to the individual. And where are you? Where's that government? Does it hurt? Yeah, you feel the whole weight of government. Now, what's interesting about this is with types of governments like communism, socialism, things like that, they try to tell us that that's to spread the burden of government out. And it doesn't work. What ends up happening is it focuses the burden of government on each and every one of us. And so it's much more painful with these types of governments. So the founders knew that they needed to change things. And they clearly understood ruler's law and the chief characteristics. So we're going to go through a couple of these chief characteristics of ruler's law. Number one, authority under ruler's law is nearly always established by force, conquest, or legislative usurpation. Right? Therefore, all the power is concentrated in the ruler. So ruler's your blank. Now, because the ruler took this by force, then the people are treated as the subjects of the ruler. Number three. Number four, the entire country is considered to be the property of the ruler. He speaks of it as his realm. It's my realm, you see. All right? We see this happening in our day. Remember a handful of years ago when President Clinton stood at the north rim of the Grand Canyon because he didn't have the courage to go into Utah to do what he was going to do here, but he stood at the north rim of the Grand Canyon and declared millions of acres of southern Utah off limits. Off limits to discovery, to recreation, just off limits. It's like he said, "This is my realm," or the federal government, "This is my realm." Off limits. This is my property, right? And the people in Utah, they are and continue to be pretty mad about that because he bottled up, and as we found out later, he bottled up all this shale oil that they finally figured out how to get the oil out of the shale in a way that was profitable. And this is right when Bill Clinton was making cutting deals with China and oil and stuff like that. And so he bottled up all those natural resources as if it's the realm of the federal government, right? And this happens with both parties. In fact, one of the worst culprits of this was Theodore Roosevelt, who basically stole millions of acres of land all over the country, all in the name of national parks and things like that. And a lot of that is the area of natural resource as well. Number five, the people have no unalienable rights. The king giveth, and the king taketh away. Number six, the government is by the whims of men, not by the rule of law. Number 7, the people are not equal, but are divided into classes. Number 8, the thrust of government power is from the top down, not from the people up. Number 9, the ruler issues edicts, which are called the law. He then interprets that law and enforces it, thus maintaining a tyrannical control over the people. So he makes the law, he enforces the law, and he judges the law. Okay? This is exactly why Polybius and Montesquieu and eventually John Adams said you got to separate that. Got to get those things out from under one person or under just a group of people. Number 10, problems are typically solved by issuing new edicts, creating more bureaus, appointing more administrators, and charging the people more taxes to pay for these so-called services. Under this system, taxes and governmental regulations are oppressive, very oppressive.
But yet we have executive orders in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. And we'll cover executive orders when we talk about the executive branch, yeah. And we'll see what kind of executive orders can be made and what kind we can't. But you can see that all these executive orders coming down from the executive branch over the last number of administrations is this type of thing. So as we go through this list, what kind of law do we live under?
Ruler's law.
Right? Ruler's law, absolutely. Number 11, freedom is never considered a viable solution to anything. Right? So I was in a couple years ago, I was at the National Constitution Center, and they had this video playing in this one section, and I was surprised that this video made this statement. But it was some lady talking, and she was talking about how there are problems with freedom. Freedom's difficult. It's kind of dirty sometimes. But then she said, but to solve those problems, to eliminate freedom is never the solution to those problems. It always makes those problems worse. And so that's absolutely correct. But under ruler's law, they never consider freedom as a solution. Number 12, the transfer of power from one ruler to another is often by violence. Violence, your blank there. Number 13, the long history of ruler's law is one of blood and terror, both anciently and in modern times. Right? And it's continually been an excessive system of taxation, regulation, and a continuous existence of misery. Misery is your blank there. So this basically are the main tenets to tyranny or to ruler's law, and the founders were very, very familiar with this. Now Jefferson and the other founders hoped to find this middle balance where government rested its authority on the people. People is your next blank there, people. And they did this by turning that pyramid right side up, literally spreading the burden of government out by dividing and subdividing government and making it so that all the power came from the people up to the community, up to the states, and finally up to the federal government. So it's this power that comes up from the bottom. And then they placed that right in the balanced center. And so they turned to a couple of civilizations to kind of get some of these great ideas. Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson's your next blank, was the first one to make the pilgrimage through some of these civilizations. Now the first one that we're going to talk a little bit about are the ancient Israelites. Now you'll remember from your Sunday school classes, right, a little bit about the Israelites and about Moses. And remember, Moses had 3 40-year periods in his life. Where did he spend the first 40 years? Egypt. Pharaoh's court, right? And what kind of government do you think he learned there? Ruler's law. Very heavy-handed ruler's law, right? Then he killed the Egyptian and had to flee, and he spent the next 40 years where?
Desert.
Out in the desert, the wilderness of Midian, among the Ishmaelites. And they were a tribal people, and so he probably saw a lot of different types of ruler's law to anarchy, and it's believed that Jethro was most likely the head of the tribe that he was part of, and Jethro understood people's law and things like that. So then after that, end of that second 40 years, Moses gets his call, right? And he returns back to Egypt, and after a few unpleasantries, he ends up freeing the Hebrews. Right? And he gets them all out into the wilderness. Do you know how many there were?
600,000.
There were 600,000 families, right? So we estimate that to be somewhere between 2 and 4 million people. So about 3 million people. So imagine this. Moses gets out into the wilderness, has 3 million people, gathers them all together and says, if you have any problems, just bring them to me. Right? That was a long line. In fact, there's a very long line, and he kept looking at that thinking, boy, we're never going to get through this thing. And he didn't even have time for lunch breaks, and he'd go to sleep, and he'd wake up the next morning, and that line would be longer than it was the night before. And so this was stressing him out. So he had a gentleman over here on the sidelines. Who was that? His father-in-law, Jethro. And Jethro said, Moses, that which thou doest is not good. You're not only going to waste away yourself, but this people with you if you keep up with this system. And you can just imagine Moses, well, Dad, do you have any suggestions? As a matter of fact, I do. And they put together this beautiful system of government. In fact, the structure is kind of shown here in the bottom of page 18. First of all, they took 600,000 families, and they divided it up into groups of 10 families, and each of those groups appointed a leader. So 600,000 families divided by 10 families. How many leaders is that? 60,000 leaders. Then they divided up into groups of 50 families. Each of them appointed a leader. What's that? An additional 12,000 leaders. So they're now at 72,000 leaders, right? And then they divided up into groups of 100 families. So that's another 6,000. So they're now they're at 78,000 leaders. And then they divided up into groups of 1,000 families, and each of them appointed a leader. So now you're at 78,600, and don't forget Moses and one leader. Right? 78,600, one leader. Started out with one leader, and now you have 78,601. Divide and subdivide. Right? So, and then they said, as it states here at the bottom of letter H, the hard causes they brought to Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. So try to take care of things on the local most level, and then work it up from there. If you can't solve it there, if it's a disagreement between a couple families that are within that 10 family, then you bring it up to that level. If it's a disagreement between families that cross those groups, then you bring it up to the next level, and so on and so forth. You handle it at the local most level, and only bring the tough causes up there. Now, then they were told what kind of men to appoint or to elect. And if you go back up to letter F, in the middle of the page, at the very end of letter F, they were told to appoint able men. So these are capable people, right? They can handle the job, such as fear God. Now, what does it mean to fear God?
Love him.
It means to love him. And how do we love him? How do we show we love him? We obey him. That's right. And what do we obey? His law. That's right. Natural law. Those 10 commandments are all natural law principles, remember? So that's how we love him. So here we have a capable person that obeys the law, okay? Understands natural law. Men of truth, okay? Got to be honest. And I love this last one. Hating covetousness. What does it mean to covet?
Want something on somebody else.
That's right. It means that you want something that's not yours, it's somebody else's. And I think it's a little more than the wanting. I think it's the conspiring to figure out how to get without putting the work into yourself. So let's put this in modern terms. Capable men that obey the law, that are truthful, that hate. Now, the biblical term hate meant to reject wholly, to just wholly reject. So to wholly reject the concept of the redistribution of wealth. Right? Isn't that hating covetousness? That's pretty good advice. If you elect somebody who hates the redistribution of wealth, how secure is your property? A lot more secure. That's right. And so what great advice. And so there's some key characteristics in the government that was created under the ancient Israelites. And so we're going to go through some of those characteristics. First of all, number one, they were set up as a commonwealth of freemen. Freeman's your blank on the top of page 19. Set up as a commonwealth of freemen. And they were then told to go forth and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Now, where is that written on Americana today? Where do we find that? That scripture, the Liberty Bell, that's right, Leviticus 25:10, written right there on that liberty, right there on federal property, right? Don't tell the ACLU it's there. They're going to want to grind it off or something, right? Okay, so they're told to go forth and proclaim liberty. Number two, the duties and responsibilities of the people were based on religious principles and a solid commitment to morality. Morality is your blank. As it states here in these couple of quotes, Benjamin Franklin said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. In this case, in our country, we have more need of laws. And when we see laws coming out of Washington that are this thick, does that kind of give us an idea of what kind of people we are? Corrupt and vicious, right? Because we have more need of masters. And I would say that once you get to that point, that ends up making the people even more corrupt and vicious, which we need more laws, more corrupt and vicious. It's this vicious cycle, chicken and the egg kind of thing. And then John Adams, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So if our government, if people are saying that our Constitution doesn't work for today, what are they saying if we're following Adams' ideas here? It may not work for today, but that's probably because we are not a moral or religious people anymore. And once we become a moral and religious people again, then that government will work again. And again, religion here isn't talking about going to church. It's talking about our relationship, our personal relationship with God. Number 3, they were organized into small, manageable units where everyone had a voice and a vote. Everyone had a voice and a vote. There was a major emphasis on strong local self-government. Number 5, they had a system of honest money. System of honest money. Let's see, do I have any honest money here? What, this isn't honest money? Why isn't this honest money?
It's only paper.
Because it's not backed by anything, right? It has no intrinsic value. The only value that this money has is the fact that you and I say it has value. Okay? It has no intrinsic value. It also has some value because the American dollar is the world trade currency, right? And so other countries recognize it as having value. The moment those countries decide that it no longer has that value and it no longer is the world trade currency, it's toast. Okay? So that's really the only thing that gives it a little bit of intrinsic value. The land was looked upon as a private stewardship of the people, not the government. Number 7, the rights of property were protected. Number 8, the rights of life and liberty were protected. And number 9, all leaders were selected by the consent of a majority of the people. God always gives us the leaders that we ask for. Remember when the Israelites came to Samuel and they said, "We want a king." No, Samuel said, "You don't want a king. A king's going to oppress you. They're going to take he's going to bring your sons and put them into battle, and they're going to die. He's going to tax you. He's going to take so much from you. You don't want a king." And they kept saying, "But we do want a king." "No, you don't want a king." "But we want a king." "Why?" "Because all of our neighbors have kings." All right, we'll go out and find the best person we can. And they went out and found this humble person that lived in most humble circumstances, very, very poor, but just honorable. Saul was just great. And what happened to Saul once he became king? He wasn't great anymore, right? He became a tyrant, and he ended up even going to and trying to kill David. You know, David was the appointed king to be the next king, and Saul didn't like that much. Even though Saul appointed him himself and anointed him to be king, Saul tried to kill him on a number of occasions, right? So you don't want a king, is what he said. But God always gives us the leaders that we want. In fact, our leaders always reflect the kind of society that we are. How are we doing?
Not too good.
Not so good, right? Okay. So leaders are always selected by the consent of the majority. Number 10, all laws came into force only when approved by a majority of the people or their representatives. Right? Laws, you're blank. Number 11 is an interesting one. Accused persons were presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. Evidence had to be strong enough to remove any question of doubt. Borderline cases were decided in favor of the accused and left the judgment to God. God is your blank there. Thomas Jefferson once said that it would be better to let 1,000 guilty men go free than to incarcerate one innocent man. Very, very important that we make sure that we are incarcerating only guilty, because when we're not incarcerating, if we make a mistake and we're incarcerating somebody who's innocent, we've just taken their life and liberty from them. That's a pretty serious thing, especially now that you have a better understanding of what life and liberty is and property and all that. And so we've just taken that from them. That's why Jefferson said it'd be better to let 1,000 guilty men go free, because in the end, are they really going to end up being free? No, they'll be under the judgment of God. And that might happen in this life or the next, but it'll always happen. Number 12, the entire code of justice was based primarily on reparation to the victim, rather than fines and punishment by the commonwealth. This is where the concept of an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth comes from. Now, we don't have any record in ancient Israel in which somebody poked somebody else's eye out, and so they got their eye poked out. What good would that really do? You got two half-blind guys walking around camp, right? That doesn't do any good. But an eye for an eye basically meant that you had to pay reparations. So you go to, the guy who lost his eye goes to the guy that poked his eye out and says, hey, I at least need my medical expenses paid here, and I've got some lost wages. Can you help me out? And the guy says, I'm not helping you out. So they go to court, and the judge looks at the situation and says, well, how much do you think you need? Well, I think I need $100,000. That's a lot of money back in those Israelite days. And so, I can't pay $100,000. The other guy said, I can't pay that. And so the judge says, well, how much can you pay? Well, let's see, I can probably borrow $5,000 from my parents, and I can mortgage my tent for another $5,000. I'll borrow $5,000 from a friend, and I got $5,000 in the bank, $20,000. $20,000, that's not going to cut it. The guy's sitting there, I can't even see. How am I supposed to live off of $20,000? Well, I guess I can give you the $20,000, and I can probably just make payments over the years until, we can get it to where it's about $75,000, next 30 years or whatever. And the guy said, all right, okay, I'll take that, realizing he's not going to get any more. And so what does the judge say? He said, all right, we got this worked out between the two of you. And then he would point to the guy who did the poke the eye out. He'd point to this cauldron that had a branding iron there in their poker for poking eyes out, and he'd say, remember to keep up your payments. Right? So it's always with the threat of having the same thing happening to you, but very rarely would that happen because you're paying reparations back to the victim. How does it work today in our society? You get arrested for something, right? You pay a fine. Who gets the fine? The government does. And then you get incarcerated, and who pays for you while you're in jail?
The victims.
The victims. That's right. That doesn't make any sense, does it?
No.
Now, over the last 25 or 30 years, some of the states have realized that this doesn't make much sense. So there are some states that have brought forth some laws now that are paying reparation back to the victim, and it works a lot better than just simply having this system where the government profits from the criminals and the victims never get a true reparation unless they bring it to civil court. So it's an important principle there that the ancient Israelites had. Number 13, the main thrust of government was from the people upward. Only in time of a temporary crisis would you give extra powers to the leader or to the government. This is where the founders included in the Constitution the war powers. War is your blank for number 15, the war powers. But as soon as that emergency is over, you take that power right back from them. You don't let them keep it. That's one of the problems we have in our country today. That we still have war powers acts that were signed back in World War I, World War II, that gave extra powers to the president. And we absolutely should have repealed those after those wars were over. Number 14, the government was required to operate according to principles of law, not the whims of men. Law is your blank. And because this system of government expressed the will of the majority of the people, it allowed power to be transferred from one regime to another by peaceful means. Peaceful means. So the Israelites lived under this system for quite some time. They were very successful under it. And then they have a couple of kingdoms that split up. They end up getting kings. They start abandoning these principles. And every time they abandoned these principles, they would start failing. If they reinstituted them, they would start succeeding again. Okay? So this is very clear. When Jefferson is seeing this pattern, abandon principles, problems, go back to principles, solutions. So Jefferson's seeing, okay, there are natural law principles for good government. And that's what Jefferson and other founders are discovering. So once the Israelites totally abandoned these principles, what ended up happening? What was the first nation that came in and carried off those northern tribes? Right before them, Assyrians. That's right. The Assyrians came in, they carried off those northern tribes, brought them up to Assyria, but then the Babylonians came in, and the Assyrians actually were battling with them as well, and so those northern tribes were able to escape, and they went and settled around an area right near the Black Sea, which is your next blank, and then from there, they're lost to history. We don't know what happened to them after that. And so therefore they're called the lost tribes of Israel, right? And then the Babylonians came in and carried off those southern tribes, and those southern tribes were carried off into southern parts of Europe and things like that. And then they eventually have come back, and they're come back today. So when we're talking about the Israelites, we're not just talking about the Jews. See, that's kind of who we call Israel today, but we're also talking about all these northern tribes. So the Jews are Israelites, but they're not the only Israelites. And so that's kind of important to understand. Now, so that's kind of where our study of the ancient Israelites end, because they're lost at this point. And so we begin with the Anglo-Saxons, and as you see here in the letter A, they trace their beginnings back to a people called Yinglings. Now, not dinglings, they're Yinglings, okay? And they later changed their name to Angles or Anglos. And so again, as we had mentioned, they eventually went to the island of Britain, and that became Angles Land or England. And as you see in the letter B, they left the Black Sea area about 65 BC as the Roman legions began conquering the territory. So this is where they began, right? Where the Israelites left off, the Anglo-Saxons begin in an area right around the Black Sea. Now, what's fascinating about this is when I was younger in school, and as I started getting older and filling out like applications for work and stuff like that, and I had to fill out the application of what my race was, and I'd put Caucasian. I had no clue what a Caucasian was. And I think, who is this? What are the Caucasians? You ever know why we're called Caucasians? Because the Caucasus Mountains. You see this map right here? Between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea are the Caucasus Mountains. And because the Anglo-Saxons originated from the Caucasus Mountains, and that's where the Anglos' ancestry came from, that's why we're called Caucasians. Isn't that great to know that? Well, when I learned that, it was very liberating to know where I originated, where I came from. You know, it's interesting because in our country we talk about how important it is to allow various immigrants and things to keep their heritage and know where they came from. And I agree. I think it's very important that we understand our heritage and who helped create us for who we are. But yet, the majority of America has no idea what our heritage really is, where we came from. And so that's it's very liberating to know that. Very exciting. Now, what's interesting about the Anglo-Saxons, you'll see here on this map, is they began traveling, as it states there in letter B, when the Roman legions came in, and they start traveling across into Europe. And so they end up dividing up and separating and becoming a number of different types of people. And they began migrating to the island of Britain around 450 AD when they came there to conquer some Celts. Celts is your next blank for letter C. And then they decided to settle there permanently. The Anglo-Saxons were the best organized people in Europe, and among those best organized people were the Vikings. Vikings is your next blank. And the Vikings actually went off and discovered a lot of land, and they kind of went up north, but they eventually even settled a couple of settlements in North America a few hundred years prior to Columbus, mostly up in kind of New England and Canada area, because they came across Greenland, Iceland, and down into northern part of North America. But those civilizations, of course, disappeared long before Columbus landed. Now, this next paragraph, letter E, is very interesting. Many have thought the Yinglings or Anglos included a branch of the ancient Israelites because they came from the same territory of the Black Sea and because they preserved by some means the same unique institutes of government. Government's your blank, as those that were given to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. So it's fascinating that, and you can see with these migration patterns that they started right where the Israelites left off, and so that's why some people believe that there's a tie there. There's a lot of cultural tie. There's a political tie. There's not a religious tie, but if you remember, by the time those northern tribes were carried off, they had already abandoned their religion. They were already worshiping pagan gods and things like that, right? And so they had already lost their religion by the time they were being carried off. But what's very fascinating about this is that they were protected by Roman civil law that we call ruler's law or feudal law. And you'll notice right here in 450 AD, the Roman Empire is that medium gray area. And so their course, their migration trail there, totally bypassed the entire Roman Empire. And so they didn't get corrupted by this Roman civil law. They were able to keep that original law that they had if they are descendants of ancient Israel. Now, you'll notice that parts of southern part of Europe, Italy and France and stuff, they were controlled by the Roman Empire, and so that's why those Norman kings that came from those areas brought with them Roman civil law. So that explains why half of Europe didn't have this ruler's law and the other half did have the ruler's law because of that Roman civil law. So let's talk a little bit about some of the unique institutes of government among the Anglo-Saxons. Number one, just like the ancient Israelites, they considered themselves a commonwealth of freemen. Commonwealth of freemen. They organized themselves into small manageable units. And this is interesting. It's the exact same structure as ancient Israel. The head of 10 families was called a tithing man. Now, this wasn't somebody that went around collecting tithing. This was simply the 10th man, right? The head of 50 families became an obscure office that may have been called a villeman, or we do know that it was the head of a village. Village is your blank there. And the head of 100 families was called the 100-man. Now, some of you, if you've done any kind of genealogical research, you might come across an ancestor or something that was referred to as 100 men. And so this was somebody who was a leader of this 100 families. Now, the area that they called 100 families was called a ward, W-A-R-D. And so that's where some of the names of ward comes from, with like the 9th Ward in New Orleans that got flooded, right? And some of the eastern states here have wards, and that's kind of the concept. The concept is about 100 families. And the moment you get more than 100 families, you divide the ward. Then the head of 1,000 families was called the alderman, later shortened to earl. Now, you wonder, how does alderman shorten to earl? If you notice the spelling there, that's one rendition of the spelling. Another rendition that I've seen is E-A-L-D-E-R-M-A-N. And so that kind of helps you understand how they get earl out of it, just because of the spelling. Now, the territory occupied by 1,000 families was called a shire, and the administrative assistant to the earl was called a sheriff, or as we pronounce it, a sheriff. That's right. So a sheriff was the administrative assistant to the earl. 1,000 families, it's about a county level is what it was considered. And the founders said that you never, and the Anglo-Saxon said this too, you do not ever have law enforcement at a higher level than this 1,000 family level. Because you want to know law enforcement, you want them to know you. You don't want there to be this stranger wall dividing between them. Because you'll see more abuses from law enforcement and from the people as well if you have this anonymity, right? So you always keep it right at the level. They didn't agree with the state law enforcement. The county level was the highest. That's why when it comes to constitutionally in our structure, the sheriff is the highest law enforcement authority in the country. And the Supreme Court has continued to uphold that over the years. They've said that a sheriff, there's been some sheriffs, one in Arizona, another one up in Wyoming, that have said, hey, if federal agents are coming into my county, you've got to check in with me first. And the federal agents tried to fight that, and the Supreme Court said, no, absolutely right. They're the highest law enforcement in the land. And so they've got to come and check in with you if they want you to, if that's what they're requiring. So the sheriff's very important. Number 3, all laws as well as the election of leaders had to be by the common consent of the people. Number 4, the laws by which they were governed were considered natural laws given by divine dispensation and were so well known by the people that they didn't have to be written down. Remember, they didn't write it down. That was their weakness there. Okay, didn't write it down. Authority granted to the chieftain in time of war was extremely limited. Your next blank there, limited. And was taken away as soon as the emergency had passed. The primary responsibility, I know that you wish that we lived this one, the primary responsibility for resolving problems rested first of all with the individual, then the family, then the tribe or community, then the region, then finally the nation. Okay, remember Moses? This lower things handle on the lowest most level, and then difficult things bring it up the ladder there. They believed the rights of the individual were considered unalienable. And then number 8, their system of justice was based on payment of damages to the victim rather than calling it a crime against the whole people. So that's basically the system of the Anglo-Saxon. You see how it's virtually identical to that of the ancient Israelites. What's also interesting is that it's identical to the system of government that you learned that we had from your grandparents, right? But when we went through ruler's law, you realize that we've corrupted it. But you realize that these are the doctrines that originally established our nation. So here we have the founders going through all this history. They've got this history of England where they learned that you don't lose your rights. You got to write them down, okay? And then they get into a 180-year period of trial and error from Jamestown to the Constitutional Convention, right? When that Constitution was put forth. And then we have these two ancient civilizations. And so now they're ready to start putting a government together, but they were missing one component, and that is, are there natural law principles for economics? And they had a little bit of an idea because ancient Israel had some clues in the Bible, but it didn't really outline their economic system. And so they were really searching for this. And just in the nick of time, 1776, a gentleman by the name of Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever read the entire 5-volume set of The Wealth of Nations, but Adam Smith is not the easiest author to read. It's I kind of compare it to you basically jump into his brain and you get rattled around a lot, and then he kicks you back out. And so it's difficult to read. So what we do here in the next few minutes is going to be far easier than reading the 5-volume set of Adam Smith. And so this is what the founders discovered or learned from him. First of all, the economics was based on natural law. So natural is your first blank under Roman numeral number 4. Natural. And then letter B, in his book, Adam Smith said, wealth is not gold and silver, your next 2 blanks. He said that you don't measure a nation's wealth on gold and silver. He said, because if you have a nation that has $100,000 worth of gold and a nation that has $150,000 worth of wine, which one has the most wealth? Well, the $150,000 worth of wine, right? Because they can sell it for $150,000, right? Not because they can drink it. It's because they can sell it for $150,000, okay? And so he said, you measure it by their quality of life, the necessities of life, how easy it is to obtain the necessities of life, how cheap it is, the quality and things like that. And so he said, that's really how you measure the wealth of a nation. And he said, so what you really want to do if you want a nation to be able to excel is you want them to be able to get the necessities of life in a way that is abundant and cheap, which is your next blanks, abundant and cheap. So he put together a formula as to how this can best be achieved. First of all, number 1, specialized production. Production's your blank there. Let those who do what they do best do what they do best, right? Just let them specialize right in on that exact thing, okay? Number 2, buying and selling in a free market. Let the market decide whether or not a product is successful or unsuccessful, okay? Very important to just let it be totally free. And it should be based on the natural law principle of supply and demand. Your next blank's there. That is a natural law principle. Guaranteed every time. Increase the supply of something, what happens to the value? Goes down. Decrease the supply, value goes up. And that happens with everything, especially with commodities. Now, a commodity is defined as something that really doesn't have any difference from one seller to the next other than price, okay? And that includes money. Money is a commodity. Currency is a commodity. And so you can decrease the value of that commodity money if you increase the volume of it. And it'll happen every time. So very important that you be careful with that with our currency. Number 4, everyone improves his position by making a profit. Boy, in some places that's a bad word, isn't it? Profit? But I like the way that it's defined here in this book. A profit is defined as doing whatever is necessary to make an exchange worthwhile. Make an exchange worthwhile is your next blank. Are there any profit mongers in here? Yeah? Oh, yeah. All of us should. All of us should raise our hand, okay? Now, we can get rid of the word monger, but we're always in everything for a profit. Even if it's not money, you're in it for a profit, okay? I go out and teach these seminars and things for a profit. And what that profit is hopefully a stronger citizenry and a better nation. And also I get a tremendous amount of joy to go around the country and meet great Americans and recognize that people care about their country. And so I do it for a profit. You do everything for a profit. Even if you're doing a charitable act, you do it for the profit of doing the charitable act or the feeling it gives you or whatever. So it's everything. And is there any such thing as obscene profits? No. Now, you might personally think that somebody's making an obscene amount of profit. I think that there's industries that I think it's crazy the amount of money that some people make. For example, sports. I'm not into sports at all. And it's crazy the amount of money that some of these athletes make. But it's not up to me to decide. Who's it up to decide? The market. Because as long as somebody's making an obscene profit, it means that people are willing to pay an obscene amount of money. And with something like sports, I agree with that. I think some of the amount of money that's spent on that is obscene, and the amount of money is made obscene. But I don't spend the money on it, so whatever. So it's not up to me to determine what's obscene and what's not obscene. It's the market. Number 5, the secret to a successful operation of a free market is competition. Now, as a business owner, this is one thing that I don't like, but it's good for the consumer, right? Okay. It's painful, but the results are good. Letter A, we end up with a greater quantity of products. Letter B, improved quality. And letter C, lower prices. And then letter D, a greater variety. So the other day, my wife sent me to the grocery store with a list of things to get. And on that list was toilet paper. So I went down to toilet paper. That's an impressive aisle. I mean, the whole aisle dedicated to toilet paper. And it comes in all, whatever, double ply, triple ply, quilted, ultra soft, sandpaper. I mean, everything, right? Now, in communist Russia, how many different kinds of toilet paper do they have?
Sandpaper.
One. Probably the sandpaper, if you were lucky to even find it on the shelf, right? And so you see what the free market does. Gives us a greater variety of product at a lower price, greater quantity and quality and all that. Okay, it works. Just like when I was our children and going from $3,500 to $2,500, and the product was better, newer hospitals. They're like hotel rooms nowadays when you go labor and delivery. And so it's just a much better experience for a lower price. Now, number 6, Adam Smith said that the greatest threat to a free market economy, it's not greed, it's not fraud, it's government interference. Government interference. Interference is your blank. But he did say that in order to keep a market free, there are 4 areas that government could or should get involved with to a degree in order to allow the market to stay free. The first one, letter A, illegal force. Okay, mafia tactics. This is where you own a restaurant in Chicago, and you got a couple of tough guys that come in, and they say, we'll provide security for you, but you'll need to pay us 10% of everything you make. And you'll say, I've never needed security in the past. And they say, you do now, right? Right? Force. Mafia tactics. So government can certainly prohibit that. Letter B, fraud. Fraud. I've got some beachfront property in Yuma, Arizona that I'd love to sell you. Right? Fraud. Letter C, monopoly. Monopoly. Now this is an interesting one because our view of monopoly today is different from what Adam Smith was talking about. How would you define a monopoly? You control it all. Okay, one person controls an entire market. Okay, so how would you legally obtain a monopoly? Not getting government involved, but how do you legally obtain a monopoly? Better product. Okay, right? Best product, lower price. It doesn't even always have to be lower price. Okay, like let's take Apple for example. Now I'm not a big Apple guy, but I do recognize that they have superior products at a higher price. But because those products are superior, they have a huge percentage of the market share. Okay, and so it doesn't always have to be better price, but better product, low price usually. And so that's how you can obtain a monopoly is by basically getting rid of your competition, right? And so how do you keep a monopoly?
Serving the customer.
Innovating.
Serving the customer, being innovative, which is, what's that preventing?
Competition.
It's preventing competition from entering into the market. If you have a product that you're producing at a high quality, low price that just makes it so hard for somebody to get started up and start producing that product, then you prevent them from getting into the market, right? But that's perfectly acceptable. Adam Smith said monopolies are fine because they're always just temporary. Now, temporary might mean 70, 80 years, so to us that might not seem temporary, but in the grand scheme of things, they're temporary. So what he's referring to is government monopolies. Okay, now what do you think of when you think of government monopolies?
TVA.
Post office.
Schools, okay. Post office.
Utilities.
Utilities is a good one. What about the airlines? Remember the airlines? Remember when telephones? And so this is interesting, some of these answers here, because some actually are proper in the hands of government. Originally, post offices and post roads. Founders recognized, that's a pretty big task, and so we've got to kind of pool our resources because of building roads. But now in modern day, we're learning that that's not 100% necessary because we have FedEx and UPS and things, right? There are some things, utilities, again, where it's huge for an individual company to build this entire infrastructure. So that's an example of government having a reasonable area to get into a monopoly. But a lot of times when they privatize it, once the infrastructure is there, then that works out well. But things like airlines and telephones and some of those things, the government monopolies usually don't end up working. And the moment they deregulate them, I mean, an airline ticket back in the 60s and 70s used to be a whole lot more expensive, especially when you look at the dollar back then versus today. But that's not really the type of monopolies that Adam Smith was talking about. What he was talking about is that government needs to make sure that they do not encourage monopolies. And so, for example, what about licensing? Doesn't licensing prevent entry into the market? Now, whenever you look at licensing, if there's a new licensing bill that comes across your legislature or they're adding more regulation to it, do you know who usually is supporting those bills? The businesses that are already in the market, already in the industry. And why are they doing that?
To make it more difficult to compete.
More difficult for competition to come in, right? What about like building codes? See, I'm in the construction industry. And building codes, what do they stop? They stop innovation. Because, see, you can only build a certain way. And if you come up with some new idea, it might be out of code, you see. But see, the existing builders, they like that because they already have their way. They already have all their guys trained to be able to install things a certain way. And so it's important that they do this with the law so they keep the entry into the market. And so this is what Adam Smith's talking about, is to prevent entry into the market. We do not want government doing that. Question?
Was there ever an exception for public safety, i.e. we talk about driver's licenses, or we say roofers, where my father's a roofer, and roofing is going to be dangerous to the customer, and if someone's doesn't do a good job.
So is there any exceptions to licensing? So has any licensing ever produced a better, safer, cheaper product? Usually not, because what codes do they end up usually following? They usually follow the codes that come from the private industries. So for example, myself, in the concrete business, the laws in Arizona say that I need to follow the American Institute standard practices. That's all private. And so all that licensing tells me to go to the private industry to get those standards anyway. And then it also ends up making it so that the people end up having a false sense of security because they believe that if you're licensed, boy, that must be great. You're all right. And so they actually don't research the companies and things as much as they should. Can you think of there's actually a total huge industry that doesn't have they have private licensing but not public or government licensing? Lawyers. Of course, the guys writing the laws exempt themselves from any kind of government licensing. But the state bars are not government. In a couple states, there's an exception to that. But for the most part, it's all private. They govern themselves, right? And so it's just, doesn't that drive you crazy? That they're the ones writing all the licensing laws for the rest of you and I, but when it comes to their industry, oh no, we can govern ourselves. So anyway, very, very frustrating. Okay, so that's the kind of monopoly he's talking about. Letter D, debauchery. So this is pornography, obscene drugs, or obscenity, prostitution, all those types of things, other forms of vice. This is not much different than letter B, fraud. This is preying on human weakness. And so this is where Adam Smith said government could get involved. But what he did say is you've got to be careful that government doesn't overtax these kind of things. They just simply regulate it, not tax it. Because when you tax it, what is that? That's government getting in the business of debauchery. Before you know it, government's promoting debauchery because they're profiting from debauchery. So you got to be careful with government getting involved. So there's 4 fundamental freedoms that has to exist in a free market. The freedom to try, the freedom to buy, the freedom to sell, and number 4, the freedom to fail. The most important one, the freedom to fail. Most painful, but most important. No matter how big you are, those banks should have been led to fail. The amount of money that George Bush was saying was going to be just taken out of our economy if they failed, we actually lost more money because of the way our economy has been for so many years than if we would have just let them fail. Right? So we ended up with a worse punishment. Isn't that what Cicero said? When you violate natural law, you end up with a worse punishment in the long run. So when Adam Smith published this new book, no country in the world was practicing his free market economics. The United States became the first nation to try it. First is your blank. So here the founders have gone through all this history now, and they figured out all this with these civilizations, and now they finally have this final piece, which is the natural law in relation to free market economics. And so that concludes this segment of the lesson, and we'll now pick it up to see what the founders did once they had all these puzzle pieces together. So thank you very much.